All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in on the next class. Um, just a couple updates if you haven't already heard that for next, at least the next month or two, these classes are just going to be pre-recordings. Things are just a little bit crazy right now in my life. It's a 6-month-old that doesn't sleep and a bunch of other things, so it's just a little bit too much to do live webinars, but it's a lot easier to do pre-recordings for me and do a little bit at a time. But hopefully, things get a little bit better. We'll go back to what live webinars, but just for now, these are going to be pre-recorded. So, and today's class, I'm really excited about today's class. It's actually a new class. We didn't do this last year in the first round of anti-racism courses, but I'm really excited because this is a really important block of history to really understand. If you really want to understand a lot of our systems of oppression, white supremacy, patriarchy, neoliberalism, things like that. These systems do have actual roots. You can actually follow it, track the beginning of these systems and how they arose. And a lot of these systems, started basically, starting like the 14, 15, 1600s in Europe around, the rise of capitalism and eventually the rise of colonialism, which was, like a vehicle to export capitalism, all across the country. And not to say there wasn't oppressive systems before, the rise of capitalism and colonialism. There was definitely really bad systems out there. Definitely, patriarchy existed, labor exploitation existed, a lot of bad stuff happened, existed beforehand, but this was an incredibly efficient system of exploitation, particularly of land and labor, particularly, and this was a system that eventually, caught on and was exported all over the world, and and a lot of justifications, things like racism, were created around these systems. So, we can definitely track, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today, the roots we can track, and we can directly trace the roots back to this time period. So that's what we're really going to kind of, in this class, we're going to kind of map out a lot of these roots. Because I really like this quote by Ned Blackhawk. The colonialism is the defining feature of American history, and we live with its legacies on a daily basis. And some of these legacies, I really like this chart as well, this graph made by the Decolonizing Conference. But it kind of maps out a lot of the legacies, like colonization can be broken into two different, forms of supremacy and different forms of capitalism. And that supremacy, broken down to eventually became white supremacy or European supremacy. That's where we saw, not only the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans and the genocide, but also the enslavement of Africans and the creation of the white race and the black race and racism to kind of justify all that. And we also saw this rise of patriarchy. There was definitely patriarchy before capitalism, for sure, and colonialism, but capitalism, we're going to talk about this today, really did solidify and create a new, very dangerous and exploitative form of patriarchy that was, again, shipped all over the world. From the devaluation of women's labor to the attack on women's reproductive health and choices and their power over their bodies. So we saw a lot of that. We'll talk about that today. And then the last part is just like what we call human supremacy, or just like the supremacy over the land, just like exploiting our land. And we're seeing this even today, where we're destroying our planet faster than it's recovering, and it's a pretty dire situation right now. So what we saw is like, we had all these forms of supremacy, but then you have capitalism was kind of like a way to kind of was a vehicle for a lot of these supremacies, like white supremacy. It created systems like plantation economies and industrial revolution factories and resource extraction systems of colonialism, where it created the system of let's make a whole bunch of wealth off of exploiting land and labor, and it created the justifications behind that as well. It also, helped with the rise of patriarchy, which we'll talk about today, and it's definitely, has a big hand on the destruction of our planet. So we're going to kind of spend the next couple hours kind of diving into a lot of this, starting in, in the 1400s and kind of working our way up through. But I think a big indicator of just like of the connection between colonialism and capitalism and where we are today is just when you look at, these two maps. So you have these two maps of one on the top is a map of all the countries that have been colonized by Europe, which is all but like 5, or 4, depending on if you think there's 2 sides on whether Ethiopia was colonized or not. And we'll talk about that later today too. But so you have majority of the world was colonized at one point, and there's 2 different colonizations that we'll talk about again today. There's like kind of a normal colonization of just like resource extraction, and enslavement, labor, exploitation, things like that, which we saw a lot in Africa and in Americas, a lot in Asia. But then you have another form, it's called settler colonialism, which that's not just about, kind of extracting and exploiting in countries and continents. That's about actually just taking the whole country over, or the whole continent over. And we saw that with the United States and Canada and Australia, where they used to be indigenous countries, now they're primarily white countries, and white, that was based on settlers, enough European settlers kind of dominating those countries. So if you look at, on the bottom map, if you look at, where the wealth is today, how it's spread out throughout the world, this is indicator, the darker the color, the more poverty there is. There are some no data countries in Africa, but if you dive a little bit deeper, there's an enormous amount of poverty. So you can kind of see Africa is mostly, darker colors on the line, the indicator of amount of poverty. So that you see the enormous amount of poverty coming from Africa, coming from Central America, South America, Asia, and then on the reverse end, you see enormous amount of wealth coming from places like Australia, Europe, America, and Canada. So basically, Europe and Europe's settler colonies that basically became Europe, extension of Europe over time. So you see that direct correlation between which countries were colonized and which ones were colonizers, and then and with the wealth that we are today. And it's important because we're going to talk about colonial narratives as well. And, part of colonization is or part of what we call decolonization is kind of dismantling different colonial systems, and that could be capitalism, that could be white supremacy, but it can also be narratives is a big one. In histories, there's a lot of histories, indigenous history, African history, Latin history that was buried or erased as part of colonialism. So a lot of decolonizing is kind of removing these colonial narratives and replacing them with decolonizing narratives. And so that big colonial narrative, at least for me growing up, is I would always think, I grew up thinking, there was also, you read about poverty around the world and you just kind of assume, a lot of the poor countries are just poor because, it's not that there's anything wrong with them, but they're, some people, do relate it to like racism, and there's something inferior with, people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color that is caused that. But a lot of people who move beyond that, just kind of feel like, again, like this meritocracy, like, these countries just made some bad decisions, or they didn't, make the right decisions, or there's some past mistakes, or, so you almost like a victim blaming thing where, Africa's poor, and it's because they just couldn't figure things out, or that's how the dice rolled. And Europe was rich because they figured it out and they made the right decisions. But in reality, within the decolonized narrative, you stop thinking about rich and poor countries, and you start realizing that, there's countries are poor because they've been colonized and enslaved and massacred and exploited, and then countries are rich because they were the colonizers that made an enormous amount of money through that brutality. And so yeah, so that's what we're going to be diving into, a lot of like just the history and how that we came from this to this, and that's really important for not only like white supremacy, dismantling white supremacy today, but also dismantling all the other systems of oppression that we're dealing with as well. All right, so the next slide, we're going to watch a video. This is an interview from an event that occurred, I think, last year during Martin Luther King Day. This was a event that was hosted by Ta-Nehisi Coates. So he interviewed a bunch of different people about different topics around things that King advocated for. And this particular interview, it's a short one, but he interviews AOC, which is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the new progressive House Democrats that were elected in 2018. And he was talking to her about connection between society that has a bunch of billionaires and a society that doesn't provide healthcare for everyone. And I'm playing this video for two different reasons. One is the way she describes how people become billionaires, how people accumulate enormous amount of wealth in the capitalist society, is not much different than how it's always been in the last 600 years, in Europe in the 14, 15, 1600s. So there hasn't been a whole lot of change on what it means to accumulate an enormous amount of wealth in the capitalist society. And the second part, I'm playing it because she talks a little bit about how we've lived through a lot of different, as a human society, we live through a lot of different, a lot of different systems of economic systems and political systems, and these are all temporary systems. Because I know it feels like sometimes when you're born into a system, you're like, this is it, this is permanent. But in reality, when you actually look at the history, these systems are temporary, and which we can definitely learn to we can choose to create new systems, more advanced systems as well. So I'm gonna play this video real quick.
I just want to drill down that a little bit more. Though. Why specifically does I'm Joe Billionaire. I made widgets. I sold those widgets. I made billions of dollars. Selling those widgets, making those widgets. Therefore, those billions of dollars are mine. Why am I the enemy of healthcare?
Well, you didn't make those widgets, did you? Because you employ thousands of people and paid them less than a living wage to make those widgets for you. You didn't make those widgets. You sat on a couch while thousands of people were paid modern day slave wages, and in some cases real modern day slavery, depending on where you are in terms of food production. You made that money off the backs of undocumented people. You made that money off of the backs of Black and brown people being paid off under a living wage. You made that money off of the backs of single mothers, and all of these people who are literally dying because they can't afford to live. And so no one ever makes $1 billion. You take $1 billion. This system that we live in, life in capitalism, always ends in billionaires. If you don't do it, someone else will. It's who decides to make that choice is kind of just up to, circumstance. But this thing that we live in starves people. And that's why we have to fight for an advanced society. And for that, I am called a radical. I am called every name in the book. But I just happen to have the view that humanity has lived in many systems and many ways that we organized our society. We have lived through monarchy. We have lived through slaveocracy. We have lived you know, in the times and societies that our ancestors established and were decimated. But all of this is temporary. Mercantilism is temporary. Slaveocracy evolved into Jim Crow, evolved into American apartheid. But I believe that mercantilism was temporary. And King talked about this too. You know, when we talk about King, no one talks about the dangerous King. No one talks about the anti-capitalist King. No one talks about the anti-poverty King. And I believe that where we are right now are at the edges of an untenable system that is starting to crack.
All right, so I really like that last line. The AOC said that we're living on the edges of an untenable system that's cracking, and just, I mean, look at, you know, just the realities of our world right now. I mean, we're growing enough food in this world to feed 1.5 times the current population. We're growing enough food to feed 10 billion people, and we only have, you know, about 7 billion in the world. Yet 25,000 people every day, you know, starve to death. 10,000 of those are children. We know that our planet is dying. We know that we have a small, you know, limited amount of time to kind of reverse what we're doing that's killing the planet. You know, about a decade to kind of stop what we're doing until we hit the point of no return. But we literally can't. You know, we're literally, you know, heading towards the point of no return with, and we can't seem to slow things down. I mean, looking at this an international pandemic that's happening right now, and we're seeing every system that we've been told is, you know, is solid, you know, completely fall apart, from our healthcare to our economy, to, you know, to our governments. You know, we're going to have another class later on that's going to focus on the modern realities of capitalism, particularly around neoliberalism and neocolonialism. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the realities. But this class is mainly going to be focused on kind of the history of capitalism, colonialism. I mean, we're going to touch a little bit on the modern realities. But at the same time, I mean, this is more about just understanding, you know, where we're coming from. And then again, you know, as AOC says, I mean, you know, all these systems are temporarily, we can change these systems, and it's you know, it is possible to change these systems that we're living in. But we're not going to be able to do that until we understand the history behind these systems. So that's what we're going to kind of dive into today. So the topics today that we're going to talk about, colonial versus decolonized narratives. You know, rise, you know, big part of colonialism is just the narratives that we use to kind of erase the real histories and realities that are happening. So we're going to talk about a couple of those. We're going to talk about the rise of European capitalism. We're going to talk about capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, African colonization, American settler colonization. Talk about you know, where Native Americans are today, directly linked to their history of colonialism, the legacy of colonialization, and then we're going to talk about decolonizing, you know, strategies to actually start dismantling a lot of these colonial structures that we've built up over the last couple centuries.